Welcome to IGCSE Computer Science tutorial. In this tutorial, we shall be looking at a sample pre-release programming task. This pre-release question features 3 different tasks that requires us to set up arrays, calculate, and select. We are going to start with the first task, but before that, it's important we read the background of the question. A teacher needs a program to record marks for a class of 30 students who have sat 3 computer science tests. Write and test a program for the teacher. Your program must include appropriate prompts. Prompts means messages for the entry of data. Error messages and other outputs need to be set out clearly and understandably. All variables, constants, and other identifiers must have meaningful names. You will need to complete these 3 tasks. Each task must be fully tested. The first task is to set up arrays, and we are required to set up 5 different arrays. The first one is student names. The second is test 1 score, which has criteria. And the criteria is that the test must range between 0 and 20 inclusive. Test 2 must be between 0 and 25 inclusive. Test 3 must be between 0 and 35 inclusive. Total score for each student will also be an array which will contain total score for each student for the 3 tests. Next, we impute and store the names for 30 students. The assumption here is that a student's name or the names of the students are unique. The final task we are going to do is to impute and store the students' marks for test 1, test 2, and test 3. All the marks must be validated on entry and any invalid marks rejected. What does this mean? It means that any mark for test 1 that is less than 0 or greater than 21 will be ignored. So we are only allowed to accept numbers within the range of 0 and 20. Likewise, test 2 and test 3. Having said this, let's look at my solution. For the first task, I will start by declaring the arrays, and this is quite simple. You use the keyword declare. The array identifier, the first array I'm declaring is student names, and another keyword array. The first value here indicates the lower bound, which means where the first index is or starts. The second value is the upper bound, which means where the index stops. And you have off, which is another keyword. Next to it is the data type. Data type indicates the format of data that student names should be in. So we also have to declare the rest accordingly. All the arrays must contain 30 entries. 30 entries. And you have to take note of the various data types. So there is only one string data type, and there is the rest contain real data type. Real in this case means that the arrays will store values that are in decimal format. The next task, having declared the arrays, is to impute students' names and test scores. We are not required, however, to validate student names as much as the assumption is that student names are unique. What we are required to do is to ensure that scores are entered within the specified range. And straight away, we start our for loop, which will loop from 1 to 30. And for each loop, the name will be entered by the user and stored in the student names array. Notice how we have indicated student names of a particular index. So this means that student names at index 1 will be stored for this particular point. So if we move on to 2, it will allow us to enter student name and store in the second index of the student names. The entire body of this loop executes within each count. We now have to validate test 1 score. And how do we validate this? First of all, we need to get an input. In this case, the identifier for this input is score 1. We now test whether score 1 meets the criteria that has been specified for test 1. And that criteria states that the score has to be between 0 and 20 inclusive. In other words, anything less than 0 or greater than 20 will not be accepted. So we are going to pass our criteria here. While score 1 is less than 0 or score 1 is greater than 20, we output an error message. Score must not be less than 0 or greater than 20. Then we allow the user to make another try. So this will continue until a number within the specified range is entered. After this number has been entered successfully, it will now be stored in the test 1 scores array for that particular index. In the same vein, we are going to validate entries for test 2 and that of test 3. This is supposed to be test 3, please. So having validated this, we are finally done with our task 1. You can always pause the video just to understand the connections between the entire code. Let's move on to the next task, which is task 2. And I'm going to read before we look at my solution. Calculate the total score for each student and store in the array. Calculate the average total score for the whole class. Output each student's name followed by their total score. Output the average total score for the class. This is quite simple. Now let's look at my solution. Task 2. Again, we are going to start a loop, which is going to take us from 1 to 30. So what that means is that we want to execute this 30 times. The first thing we are going to do is to calculate student total score and store in the total scores array. And for each count or for each index, we are going to add the total scores of the students, which will be done by adding test 1 score and this is supposed to be test 2 score, and of course test 3 score. Please do not be deceived by this. It is actually a typographical error. So this is supposed to be test 2 score over here, right? And this is test 3 score. So if all the test scores for test 1, test 2, and test 3 are added, the entire score for each student will then be stored in the total scores array. And the student's name alongside their score will be rendered as output. So this is where the student names and scores will be rendered as output. We move on to calculate the total score for the class. And this is done by the totaling technique, whereby we have to initialize a total variable to 0, and we loop through the total scores and keep adding to whatever we have in the class total score. So for index from 1 to 30, class total will become class total plus total scores at a given index position. Then we move to the next index until we get to the last index. The next subtask for this task 2 is to calculate and output class average. Having gotten the total and stored the total in the class total score, the average is going to be class total divided by 30, because there are 30 students. So this is how we get the average and store in the class average variable. Then finally, we output the average score for the class. The ampersand here is a concatenation operator, which is used to join the string the average score for the class is with the variable class average. Let's look at task 3, which is the last task we are going to work on. Select the student with the highest total score and output their name and total score. Let's see my solution. First of all, I will start by selecting the largest total score. I have assigned the value -1 to the variable largest. And the reason is that the least number permitted to be entered in the test scores is 0. So negative values are not permitted to be entered. So the assumption here is that the first largest value is negative. This is because it is not possible for any of the scores to be negative. So going on with my loop, I will check whether whatever that is contained in the total scores array for a given index is greater than the largest. Of course, for the first value, it will be greater than the largest, which happens to have the value of -1. And since that is the case, a replacement occurs whereby the largest will be assigned whatever value is stored in the total scores of index. And it keeps moving on until the last value. This is how the largest will be found. And the largest we've found will be used to check the students that have that particular value. So what we are doing here ideally is to perform a search, which is linear search. Select and output the students with the largest score. We loop again and check whether the total scores at any given index is equal to the largest, which has already been found. If it is, that means that student has the largest. So this takes care of students that have it takes care of multiple students that have the largest score. So in that case, it will not keep replacing or outputting only a single student. It has to take care of all the students that have the largest score. And this is what this program is doing. So at this point, this is the end of my solution to the task specified at the beginning of this document. Thank you for watching, and ensure to subscribe for subsequent videos that shall be uploaded here.